Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Julie Turnock. I'm the director of the Roger Ebert Center for Film Studies and professor in media and cinema studies. So welcome to the 2026 Ebert Symposium's keynote delivered by Professor Alfred Martin, entitled What the Wiz Was and Is, Distribution, Fandom, and the Wiz, as part of the Onscreen Fantasies, IRL Illusions, Fandom, Parasocial Relationships, and the Media. So in the previous session, we had a really excellent roundtable with ICR graduate students, PhD students, and so now we will have Professor Alfred Martin, who is an associate professor of media studies at the University of Miami, Florida, as well as chair of the Department of Cinematic Arts. He's the author of two books, Fandom, For Us, By Us, The Pleasures and Practices of Black Audiences, and The Generic Closet, Black Gayness, and the Black Cast Sitcom, and editor of two books, Rolling, Blackness and Mediated Comedy, and The Golden Girls Reader, Essays from the Lanai with Taylor Cole Miller. Martin has also written essays for The Washington Post and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and has been interviewed and cited in the New York Times, USA Today, The Washington Post, and NPR's Marketplace, among others. So please welcome Professor Alfred Martin.
Well, thank you all so much for coming out today, and also thank you to the Ebert Center for having me today. So today I'm going to talk about some work that is sort of old-ish work in the sense that it is part of Fandom, For Us, By Us, but also I am working on a book that, as I was telling some of the graduate students, I sort of say is about the Wiz, but it's actually not really. And when you see me talking today, you'll understand why that is not a thing, or why I don't describe it that way. So first of all, can we get the screen to switch to perfection? It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And so, yes, all right. So I am going to, because I am a feminist, I am going to start with the I, which is that I am a fan of the Wiz. And there are two ways that, two things rather, that particularly demonstrate my fandom of the Wiz. One is this photo from when I was in junior high school as the eye of the tornado in my local production of the Wiz. The second is that this is the now defunct theater where in Northwest Detroit, where I saw the Wiz for the first time. And interestingly, I only remember the theater where I saw two films when I was a child. One was an extraordinarily joyous occasion, which was when I saw the Wiz here at the Northwest Theater. And the other was at a theater called the Mercury Theater, also in Detroit. And it was because I saw the film The Elephant Man when I was far too young to have seen that movie. So what I'm going to talk about today, though, is The Wiz. And so The Wiz is this spectacular, I would argue, film that was made in 1978 by Sidney Lumet and Company for $23.4 million. And the $23.4 million is important because at the time, The Wiz is actually the most expensive black cast film that had been made up to that time. And as a result, it is what Andre Cavalcanti calls a breakout text. And it is a breakout text because it does a couple things. One, it breaks into the mainstream, i.e., this is a film unlike the films pejoratively called the blaxploitation films of the early 70s. These films, The Wiz rather, is markedly different because in some ways of its budget. And we should also add that $23.4 million is about $116 million in 2026 dollars. So we're talking about an extraordinarily expensive film. It also breaks from historical representational tropes. And in that way, it is, we don't see the sort of the mammy, we don't necessarily see the buck, we don't see those kinds of stereotypes that lots of folks rail against. And then thirdly, it breaks it into the audiences, or the lives rather, of audiences that it is supposed to represent. And so Part of the Wiz's import is because it is its breakout text. At the same time, we cannot sort of sidestep the idea that the Wiz does not recoup its production budget, and instead it only makes about $13 million at the US box office. So to real quickly, in Hollywood math, because I don't count, because I'm a dancer and a former dancer and I don't count except for up to 8. So I'm gonna round the budget to $24 million. So in Hollywood math, a $24 million film means that it has to make $48 million to break even because of the cut that they, which is usually about a 50% cut with the theaters for exhibition. This was also why, no, I'll talk about that later, so I'm gonna table that for a second, but this is why, and I'm gonna come back to it. All right, so, this is the thing that sort of set me off on this path to this book, and I read this in 2012, and it entirely shook the foundation on which my love of the Wiz rested. Because I never knew that the Wiz opened to allegedly small or smaller audiences. Because The Wiz was always a film that I understood as a success. Because 1, I saw it when I was a kid. 2, it always recirculated on television. 3, my elementary and junior high school stayed doing productions of The Wiz. And so it just felt like it was a success. And so I started with this question of figuring out, not sort of taking the idea that The Wiz failed as a foregone conclusion, but instead sort of saying, why does it fail? And trying to do this sort of forensics on how does this film fail? And so I say that I worship at the church of a scholar named Julie Daci, because she gave us what is called the circuit of media study. And the circuit of media study suggests that if we're going to actually fully understand something, we actually have to understand its production, we have to understand its distribution, we have to understand reception practices. Uh-oh, whoops, I went too fast. We also have to understand its reception practices. And so, and I should also add, because Julie Daci is a feminist, she put an R there, and that R is actually about the idea that the researcher is the person always keeping the balls in the air. So it is very much about feminism and not sort of trying to hide yourself behind some random notion of objectivity, because none of us are objective in our work, by the way. All right, so I want to start then by talking about production. And I want to begin partly by talking about the Wiz's road to production. And so The Wiz, of course, starts as a Broadway production in 1975, and it posts its closing notice on opening night because the proverbial nobody is interested in seeing The Wiz. So what happens is that 20th Century Fox gives the production some additional funds because they're actually backing the Broadway production. They give them some additional funds to do a television commercial, and simultaneously, the cast embarks on a word-of-mouth campaign in which they go uptown to Harlem on Sundays to the churches, and they say, hey y'all, there are black people on Broadway downtown, you should come. Stephanie Mills, who plays Dorothy in The Wiz on Broadway, is a church girl from Brooklyn, and so she goes down to the Brooklyn churches and she says, hey y'all, I'm uptown, and I'm in The Wiz, and y'all need to come and see it. And then all of a sudden, The Wiz becomes a runaway hit. But that does not mean that 20th Century Fox is happy about the money that they have spent. And so they decide to pull out of the production, and the film bounces around Hollywood. It ends up at 20th Century Fox. It ends up at Warner Brothers for a short moment. And this is actually, for me, is important about how this film starts to become shaped. So in this memo by Warren Lieberfarb, who is an executive with Warner Brothers, he says, we need to cast this with well-known black stars so that we can attract an audience. So he says we have to increase the audience want to see, lower the possibility that it will be perceived as a black picture, and probably improve negotiable terms with exhibitors. So he's actually trying to sort of play with that 50% number that I was just talking about as well. But I want to sort of point to this piece, which is that the perception of this film as a black picture. So this idea here then is that in this post-blaxploitation era, the period that runs from roughly 1972-ish to about 75, 76, depending on who you ask, they're really interested in making The Wiz a crossover film. And we should also sort of add that crossover never really means crossover. It just means we are more interested in white people than we are in others. And so that shapes the way that The Wiz begins to develop. So Lieber Farb is suggesting Melba Moore, depending on makeup, which is super, super shady, as Dorothy or Natalie Cole. Thank God we did not get a Jimmy J.J. Walker as Scarecrow. James Earl Jones as the Lion or Muhammad Ali, Bill Cosby or Richard Pryor as the Tin Man, and Ben Vereen as the Wiz. And then he sort of has these female vocalists in small roles like Aretha Franklin or Roberta Flack. But interestingly, we have the Good Witch of the South, Glinda, as allegedly Diana Ross. But we kind of see the way that this kind of crossover appeal really shaped the way that The Wiz was being imagined, even as Warner Brothers did not ultimately end up producing it. And what I am suggesting is that even as Warner Brothers did not, this logic of the crossover, or this logic of needing to appeal to white audiences permeated all of the decisions that Universal made when they ultimately decided to produce the film. And so this film is, of course, directed by Sidney Lumet, a Jewish director. It is who's famous for making these New York films. And in many ways, The Wiz is actually a New York film, because New York is indeed, like we talk about with stuff like Sex and the City, New York is indeed a character. In the same way, it is written by Joel Schumacher, who is a queer Jewish man who had, in fact, already worked on some black cast films like Car Wash and Sparkle. And I should add the real Sparkle, not the one that Jordan Sparks did somewhat recently, because that one doesn't exist. And so, at the same time, when we're thinking about the production of this film, it takes, like blaxploitation film in many ways, it takes this beloved white text and blackens it. And in sort of doing that, it also tries to inject some notion of black cultural politics into the film. So there's this throwaway line early in the film when Dorothy arrives in Munchkin Land, and one of the Munchkins randomly calls Evermean, the Wicked Witch of the East. She says, ooh, she was the Parks Department commissioner. And it is one of those things that, of the millions of times I've watched that film, I never necessarily paid attention to until I decided that I wanted to actually do research. And I was like, well, why would they be talking about the Parks Department commissioner in 1978 in a film? Turns out that the Parks Department commissioner was actually closing parks, was unnecessarily fining black folks for congregating in parks in and around New York. And so the idea that these kinds of cultural politics show up in The Wiz is actually quite fascinating. And this is Henry Stearns was the Parks Department commissioner at the time. Also, I read a review that this woman was like, I don't understand what these taxis going off duty is all about. And also, it was a black lady, and I kind of want to find her and set her on fire for not knowing that. But this idea that there are taxis that go off duty when black folks come around because taxis don't pick up black folks. And so it becomes about this kind of racial politic that runs through the film. And at the same vein, The Scarecrow is very much about education as uplift. And this idea that education is the way for black folks to overcome. And this becomes very important because The Wiz is a post-civil rights film and is also a film in which black folks are broadly construed, starting to sort of go, hey, wait a minute, I thought we were supposed to overcome with the Civil Rights Act of '64 and what had happened. And so the Crows are sort of continuing to think about education and sort of the Crows as the anti-education, and sort of we could also understand them as sort of Jim Crow in a way, but like that might be a stretch, but I'm gonna go with it for today. So at the same time, there's a politics of black hair. The idea that the Dorothy or the Diana Ross that we see in The Wiz is not the Diana Ross we see when she's on TV. And there's something really fascinating about, with the exception of Love Child on the Ed Sullivan Show. Oh, I'm also a Diana Ross fan. But she has this Afro wig. And so that becomes extraordinarily important for Diana Ross, this crossover diva, this crossover pop diva who we understand will always have miles and miles of hair flowing behind her. And instead, she's actually got an afro, which is very much about sort of what we could assume is kind of a pro-Africanism or pro-African Americanism. We also actually engage with Pan-Africanism, broadly construed. So the Emerald City is not just the Emerald City, and we also sort of take the horse of a different color from The Wizard of Oz is the way that Emerald City shakes out, but we shake it out in Pan-African flag colors. And we do red, green, and gold rather than, because I think there was a purple and a green and something else in The Wizard of Oz. And so the changing of the colors is actually about Pan-Africanism coming through in the film. So now that we sort of know a little bit about how The Wiz starts to get to the two-stage, oh wait, I do want to say this much. So The Wiz actually really, really takes off because Diana Ross decides that she wants to do Dorothy. And she actually has a really, really reasoned response, or reason rather, why she wants to do it. She has just-ish left Motown Productions. She has moved from LA to New York with her kids. She has just gotten a divorce. And she says that she feels unmoored in the same way that Dorothy does, and is in search of this notion of home. She is also going through EST training, EST training, EST, which is also what Joel Schumacher is doing. So part of the ethos of everything you need is inside of you is part of EST training. And so that's partly how and why this film develops. And so then we get to the point of distribution after we've shot the film, and so on and so forth. So I want to talk briefly about its distribution, and I'm going to focus on Detroit because Detroit is, one, my hometown, but also two, I've been able to find an extraordinary amount of really, really interesting stuff going on in Detroit around its distribution. So I'm gonna actually, although it shows in 7 theaters in Detroit, I'm gonna talk about 4 of them briefly-ish. And I'm going to talk about the ones in red. So the Madison, which is in downtown Detroit, the movie's at Fairlane, which is about 12 miles from Detroit, Beacon East, 15 miles from downtown Detroit, and then the Americana, which is about 20 miles from Detroit. And, I'm also going to say that there's going to be some language here coming up soon. So I just want to sort of flag that. So the Americana is a theater in Southfield, Michigan, which has 4 screens, with the largest being 1,750, and that is actually the theater in which The Wiz was playing. It's, as I mentioned, it's about 20 miles from Detroit, and in the Detroit News, they say, if you've been wondering, and I'm gonna stand over here, if you've been wondering about these long lines around the Americana Theater in Southfield, the answers are yes and no. Yes, The Wiz is packing them in. No, it's not setting box office records, but it's close, running just behind the pace set by Star Wars, which had the advantage of running through the summer with continuous matinees. And so we start to see that in a city like Southfield, which is, although it is 20 miles from downtown Detroit, it is actually, particularly for the Gen Xers in the room. So the Eminem film 8 Mile, 8 Mile is the street that separates Detroit from Southfield. So if you're on the south side of 8 Mile, you're in Detroit. If you're on the north side, you're in Southfield. And then a little bit over that north side is the Americana Theater. And so a number of black folks actually went to the Americana because it was so close to the city limits. And so it was, in fact, the highest grossing theater in Detroit, having gotten $49,000 in the first 3 days of exhibition in Detroit. And so, and Southfield's population was about 9% black in 1980, and the Wiz is in 88. Southfield is also the suburb that generally is the suburbs that the new black middle class from the 1970s moves to, that has been created by the automotive industry. So Southfield starts to blacken by the 1980s, and it gets more black as we move through time. Oh, there we go. Okay, and then now the Madison, downtown, another 1,800 screens on which the Wiz is playing, and it is formerly a prestige movie house. And so partly, it is still kind of sort of carrying that notion of prestige, but not quite, which is partly how the Wiz gets in there, and we'll talk about that later. But the manager at the Madison says, long lines of people waiting to buy tickets to see the Wiz, just as 4,000 people had done the night before. So in some ways, this is actually the theater that's really sort of doing hefty business in Detroit. And one of the folks I interviewed, Andrea, who is 68, says, I remember that there were a lot of people there. It's Detroit. So for me to say there are a bunch of black folks means absolutely nothing, because that's what Detroit is. And so in other words, as she recalls having seen the Wiz in 1978, she's actually talking about the number of black folks and the ways that black folks were the folks making up the space. And it was the second highest grossing theater in Detroit, making about $27,000. I should also preface this by saying, in the 1970s, in 1978, you can go to the movies for like $3. So like we have to put the $3 in context to make sure we know what we're talking about. All right, Beacon East is actually the place, and this was also really fascinating to me. One of the things I've loved about this project is actually going back through the archive and like looking through old newspapers. And so at the Beacon East, which is a suburban theater in Harper Woods, that is where they do the Midwest or Detroit premiere of the Wiz. So not downtown Detroit, not like the Americana where there's a lot of black folks, but in Harper Woods, which is about 15 miles from Detroit. And they have 2 screens, and they, as I mentioned, they hosted this Midwest premiere. And what I will also sort of say here is that it's the 3rd highest grossing with about 17 million, but Harper Woods' population was mostly white, with, as Janice, who's 75, told me, with a few upper crust Negroes among its population. So again, not very many white black folks seeing the film in Harper Woods, but still doing fairly hefty business. And they've got 0.1% of their population is black in 1980. So again, we don't have a whole lot of black folks, other than allegedly the upper crust Negroes that Janice talks about. And so this is the slide that's gonna have a little language. So Movies at Fairlane is in Dearborn. We may know Dearborn because Dearborn is actually the city that has the highest population, the highest Middle Eastern population in the US per capita. But Dearborn, about 12 miles from Detroit, had 5 screens with a sum total of 3,200 seats. But Dearborn's mayor was really vocal about not wanting black folks in his city. And in fact, and then that was from Katrina, who I interviewed about this project. And in fact, though, he is quoted as saying, I don't keep the N-words out of Detroit. I don't keep anybody out of Dearborn. Out of Dearborn. I haven't done anything to encourage them. I don't do anything to discourage them. And he actually says that with his whole chest in the Detroit News. And so obviously, black folks are not trying to go to Dearborn to see the Wiz, right? And it shows in some ways in the numbers. That it's $8,000, essentially, or a little less than $9,000 that is made at that theater. And unsurprisingly, 0.1% of Dearborn's population is white in the 1980s. And so, as we sort of see, there is a way that this film is actually being distributed where it is in these highly populated white areas. And so the question becomes then, if this is a Black cast film that is showing in these white suburban spaces and relies on white folks to see it for its success, then how does it shake out when people are actually reading the reviews of the film that are telling them to go see the film or not? So I want to turn to reception. And in reception, the reviews of The Wiz break down in the mainstream press. They're like, this ain't Judy Garland. And in fact, there's an interview where Barbara Walters asks Ken Harper, the first question of their interview. Ken Harper was the producer of The Wiz. And the first thing she says to him is, "What did you do to little Dorothy?" And so the mainstream press is largely like, I don't know what this is and I don't know why this is. And so it's like, the Wizard of Oz with Black people, that doesn't make sense to me. And so David Denby, who's writing for the New York says, "Those of us trying to play fair with The Wiz will have to hold our sentiments in check, but the film is taking a hell of a risk in going up against one of the best loved films ever made." And we should also add that with the exception of an interview with Sidney Lumet, nobody actually talks about the fact that The Wizard of Oz was a commercial failure in 1939 and did not make its production budget back until the 1950s when it was re-released in theaters. But apparently it's the most beloved film ever made, right? And we should also perhaps even against one of the best loved white films ever made, perhaps. Same with the LA Times. The LA Times says, "The terrors are not the dark forest, but of the bleak dead white of the subway platform and the monsters, not gnarled trees, but wild columns and trash cans come to evil life. The scarecrow presides over a littered vacant lot, hard by decaying tenements, and he is terrorized by jive-talking black crows wearing shades. The yellow brick road arches not into the anonymous, if heavenly skies, but over the rivers from Harlem, which is a whole lie, to the glittering towers of rich Midtown Manhattan, because the yellow brick road is never in Harlem, because that's where Dorothy is, but Harlem here does the work of blackening the film. Because Harlem is the idea, or the ideal, of where Black folk live. And in fact, I will sort of step back for a half a second. In the 3 drafts of the film, Dorothy begins in Queens, then she lives in Brooklyn. She begins in Brooklyn, then they move her to Queens before finally settling in Harlem, although her address is still a Brooklyn address, a 433 Prospect Place. But the Harlem actually does the work of blackening the text in this review. And I did not, particularly because of where I am, I had to ensure that I gave a shout out to Roger Ebert, who did not actually poorly review the film. He says, "The movie has great moments and lots of life, sensational special effects and costumes, and Ross, Jackson, and Russell. It hedges its bets by wanting to be sophisticated and universal, childlike and knowing, appealing to both the mass audience and to media insiders," which on one hand is what the film is absolutely doing. And in some ways that I would argue that is probably also part of its undoing. But I wanted to make sure that I gave a shout out to Roger Ebert and also that he positively reviewed the film in mainstream press. All right, so going to the Black press, the Black press sort of understood this within a concept that I call, and I have developed in an earlier piece called must-see Blackness. This idea that the very presence of big budgeted Black representation meant that Black folks had a civic duty to go out and spend their $3 to see it. And so the size and scope in particular of the film, so the idea that it is $23.4 million means that if it succeeds, it means that we might get more of these films, and if it fails, it is going to be the end of films like this. And so the stakes are largely being set within the Black press. And it is also important because it departs from quote unquote negative stereotypes of Blackness. And so that is part of why we're supposed to spend our money on seeing it. So Billy Rowe in the Call and Post uses his column to say, this is, meaning The Wiz, the biggest budgeted film, musical or otherwise, to ever top cast Black superstars and featured performers. Its box office success would change the face of the silver screen. The subtle battle to hold the line and not shake up the system through the failure of so costly a black film is not beyond the realm of possibility. The they who put forth all the above theories and then some would do anything to keep that from happening. So what we've got here happening in the black press, as folks like Anna Everett talk about, is the ways that the black press functions as this kind of black public sphere in which it is not only talking about what is going on in black culture, but it is actually also talking back to mainstream culture. At the same time, Marie Moore says, once again, the talents of black artists serve as a regenerative source to put life back into an insipid medium which many New Yorkers watch become stifled or bankrupt due to financial crises. She's partly talking about the sort of the death of Hollywood in '68. That was kind of the result of new Hollywood cinema-ish, and also big budget flops like, and generally musicals were falling out of fashion. So many of the musicals were flopping and flopping hard. But she goes on, just as black exploitation films in the early '70s strengthened the waning film industry, The Wiz hopefully will be the beginning of a new era of lucrative and qualitative black films. And so she is simultaneously here centering the idea of not only the idea of financial success, but she's also sort of qualitative stands in as quality. This idea that like The Wiz is a particular kind of good film that is in sharp contrast to what she calls the black exploitative films here. And so, if we sort of talk about The Wiz as a failure, the question becomes like, where does black taste fit in? And where does the idea of a black canon fit in? And so the next part of what I'm talking about is going to slightly shift gears because I want to sort of move to the fandom or the enduring fandom of the film, because I actually argue that The Wiz is a film that is a white cult film and a black canon film. And so, in my interviews with black folks, Ayanna says, I was surprised to learn of The Wiz's box office failure as an adult. I must have been in my early 20s when I found it out. So this is truly about folks not actually even knowing that this film fails. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, I think, where we talk about the ways that the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? The criteria for a cult film don't always quite fit with like how The Wiz actually operates within its black fandom. And so I want to sort of pause for a second because I partly want to ask the question of if something fails, or if something is such a colossal failure, how does it continue to circulate and why does it continue to circulate? And so I want to use two examples. The first one is from a black British woman named Ebony Bones, who is sort of a sort of dance music kind of artist, and she uses the trumpets from The Wiz's Emerald City sequence in one of her songs called We Know All About You, which, why is that? I have been, hold on y'all, because there was supposed to be sound, hang on. Oh well, we'll pretend we heard Ebony Bones and we'll pretend we heard Little Brother too, but we'll go on. All right, so now I want to sort of talk about fandom, black canon, and The Wiz as the last bit that I'll talk about before I finish up here today. So in my book, Fandom for Us by Us, I lay out 4 aspects of black canon. And so the first is that there's usually an ambivalent relationship to aesthetics, i.e., oftentimes when reviewers are reviewing films, they're looking at things like shot composition, they're looking at things like sound design, they're looking at continuity, editing, so on and so forth. There's a way that with The Wiz, we don't quite care. Secondarily, we are engaging with black feeling, this idea that the emotion, and in some ways it's connected to the ambivalent relationship, because it's the feeling that is actually more important than these aesthetics. Thirdly, it's about what I call intergenerational pedagogy, i.e., because The Wiz is a children's movie, it is often introduced by parents or grandparents or uncles or aunts. And there's a way that it then sort of gets introduced as something that's important to know. And it's partly, I might argue, also about sort of the notion of the mythic black card. Thirdly, it's about a retextualization, i.e., it is about the ways that the film gets reused in a kind of textual poaching kind of way, borrowing from Henry Jenkins. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily shift its meaning. So it is not that it's poaching to make it queer or to make it black or to make it feminist. It's actually poaching to make it mean the same thing but in a new way. And we'll have an example of that later. So real quickly, I'm going to go through a couple of slides. And this is actually also where I bring in TikTok, because TikTok used to be a treasure trove of all sorts of lovely things. And so I want to start with this clip from a TikTok user talking about The Wiz versus The Wizard of Oz. Uh-oh. Hang on. Did I? So, maybe that was all me. Let's see. Oh. Oh, no, actually, the output looks like it's on NPCR. Can we maybe check the volume in the, well, the volume in the room should be fine because I'm here, but. Let's see. Okay. All right, we're gonna move on because there's a clip coming later that we can test this out with again. So, in again my interviews, Rhea actually talks about this idea that she defines the movie as a good movie. She says, does it have poor cinematography? Absolutely, but she's struck with the length of time that she would have probably still been connected to The Wiz. And she mentioned Tier Potluck because the conceit of this particular chapter is that I talk about The Wiz with a group of my best friends who've been my best friends for, Jesus Christ, for 35-ish years. And of all of the things that we share with one another, there is no object other than The Wiz that connects all six of us. There's a way that we'll be connected, like there's 3 of us who are connected to something, 2 of us connected to something, 5 of us connected to something. But this is the only thing that, other than each other, that all 6 of us are connected to. And so she's sort of, again, she's talking about this ambivalent relationship. And in the terms of black feeling, Ayanna sort of talks about, I don't know how I was, but I have a memory of being scared of the Munchkins. I was watching it alone and I ran down the stairs. I was at my grandmother's house. I was in her bedroom watching it and went downstairs to find my mother because when those people came off the wall, I was through. And so, but it is about sort of this idea that it is this sort of collective feeling, and this collective feeling of fear that is invoked by this film, but it is the sort of psychoanalytic ideal of like I am scared of this thing, but I can't turn away. And she has not been turning away from this film for like 30 years, right? Simultaneously, Erica says when Dorothy first gets to Oz with the Munchkins, it's very dark, where it's like the paper doll chain. It's like something that's not supposed to be scary has got you. Remember, I was at my aunt's house and I was upstairs in her bedroom watching TV. The Wiz comes on and I'm watching it, and like I was scared and I couldn't really pull myself away. So again, she's doubling down on that sort of psychoanalytic. And also, most people always talk about the subway scene as their horror story, because that is traumatic for a child. And I was actually, the first time I went to New York, I was very afraid to get on the subway for that reason. And the next thing I want to talk about is this intergenerational pedagogy, because Corey says, I remember watching The Wiz with my Uncle Raymond. Like, we'd be, just randomly sitting around, and he'd be like imitating the Tin Man in the Field, saying, a teeny, a teeny. And we'd just burst out laughing. That's my memory of The Wiz. It was before I was 10, for sure. So again, it's about the ways that this film partly becomes about the familial relationships. I have an interview with a woman that's for the book version of this, and she talks about, and we were actually both in this interview bawling, because she talked about the ways that her mother introduced her to The Wiz, and now that her mother is deceased, The Wiz is the way that she feels connected to her mother. So when she feels like she misses her mother, she turns on The Wiz. And so it's this way that it is, it's about this connective tissue that is, on the one hand, about The Wiz, but also not about The Wiz, or at least about what gets packed on top of The Wiz in terms of feeling. And the last thing, and I hope we have sound working, because the retextualization in everyday life is really important, because it is about the ways that we can shift what we are, we can shift the terrain on which we're talking about The Wiz without changing the meaning of it. And so, this is also a language moment as well. So, so bear with me, and we're gonna try and hope. Nope, no such luck. Do you have something to try? All right, one moment, please. So it should be right there. Sound? Yeah, but what? All right. The old-fashioned way. Because sometimes you just gotta go back to the ways of yesteryear. All right. Because I feel like if we have sound, I have to go back to this.
Unless you agree with me that The Wiz is better than The Wizard of Oz in every...
It ain't never been no correlation between the two, ever. The Wiz is an experience. The Oz is a movie.
And like, again, part of the reason that I like that clip is because even sort of talking about the differences in the way that sort of Blackness engages, or Black folks engage with the film, is like, I watch The Wizard of Oz, and like, as a general rule, like, nobody hates on Judy Garland, but I have an experience when I watch The Wiz, and that's something that is that is different. Okay, so now, yes, all right, so now, again, language, but I love this clip so much, so I hope you enjoy it as well, about retextualizing The Wiz.
Ooh, my nigga, we done found the hoes. We done found the hoes.
And so what I love about that is that it takes the idea of Ease On, or the melody of Ease On Down the Road, and the scene with the poppies, and sort of talks about, we found the sex workers. And the scene doesn't mean anything differently than it did in the film. And in some ways, like, we're using Ease On Down the Road, which is familiar to the film, but at the same time, we've reshaped the lyrics, and it means exactly what they're saying it means. And it sort of works within that universe. And so, Erica sort of talks about the ways that the dialogue and music in The Wiz has become a part of our lexicon as a group. It's part of our vocabulary, just like when slang slides into the dictionary. It's like a shared language. I know that you understand what I'm saying when I say you can't win. Or my friend Bria will always say, don't bring me no bad news. And so we sort of know what those mean, even as they kind of can mean something different, but they are, it is about the logic of the fandom. And so, to wrap up, The Wiz is really what Raquel Gates calls cinematic two-ness. She builds on Du Bois's work, and she suggests that in talking about cinema, and she's talking about coming to America, she says Eddie Murphy is actually trying to make one film, and the director, John Landau, is trying to make a different one. And so, in some ways, then, The Wiz becomes too black for white reviewers and audiences, which is really about its racialized media reception, which I coined in 2018, I think. And so it is this idea that we are all within our sort of individual subject positions, and those subject positions shape the way that we engage with media. And so The Wiz, in some ways, was actually just too black, and also was too radically different from what Judy Garland and the 1939 MGM film had done. But as I mentioned, it's over-distributed in white suburbs. And in that over-distribution, it means that the suburban expansion and urban disinvestment really plays in here. So in other words, with the urban disinvestment, we have a number of formerly first-run theaters shifting into being second and third and discount theaters. And as the suburban expansion is happening is where we have the new big pretty theaters. But at the same time, as we see with a place like Dearborn, the suburban spaces are not necessarily hospitable for black bodies to be in there watching film. And so at the same time, The Wiz actually attempts to be this universal story that hails black viewers through gestures toward 1970s cultural politics. I'm sorry, we'll keep moving. And the film then becomes a film designed, or at least thought to be designed for everyone. With a $23.4 million budget and a $13.2 million box office haul, The Wiz is, in fact, a box office failure. But of course, we don't actually talk about the $10 million that Universal received during the production from CBS for the exclusive first-run syndication rights. And the flip side was that if you all paid attention, those of you who were in the room last night and saw The Wiz, the microphones in Emerald City have the CBS eye on it, which was one of, I am fairly certain it is one of, if not the first, product placements in cinema history. But Donald Bogle actually talks about the 1970s as saying it started with the belief that there was a black audience, and then it ended sort of saying black audiences and black film was dead. And so, in the wake of The Wiz, what happens? We ultimately end up in the industry, we get these ideas that black audiences want representation, and black audience sort of suggests that to see black representation is their civic duty, so it becomes about a commercial exchange. And I would suggest that The Wiz actually becomes ground zero for must-see blackness. And I would argue that it is a relay that started in 1978, and it's a relay we're still doing as recently as Sinners. And white audiences did not see The Wiz, and black audiences were the ones blamed for that. And so in other words, the idea that like black theaters or theaters in black neighborhoods were bursting at the seams with black folks seeing The Wiz, black folks were the ones who paid the representational price for its failure, or for the failure of white folks to see it. And so what we get instead is the interracial buddy comedy. And so Richard Pryor, in some ways, is plucked out of The Wiz, and he becomes sort of the interracial buddy comedy dude before Eddie Murphy, before Danny Glover. And it's 10 years before we actually get another big budget black cast film, which is Eddie Murphy's Coming to America, made for $36 million, which is about $350 million in 2026 dollars. And I actually have, yes, I knew I had that there somewhere. And so with that, I am going to leave it for the question Q&A. Thank you so much for listening.
All right. Do we have any questions to start us off with?
She's coming with the mic.
The Wiz and sinners keep talking, please.
It is really just about, on the one hand, it's about the what I term as must-see blackness, the idea that black patronage is necessary for particular kinds of black representation. So it is still tied up in some ways in a politics of like positive and negative representation, or at least good and bad representation in some ways. And so this idea here is that in order for black, so I am working on, or I have this idea that's bumping around in this place that is actually thinking through the commodification of representation and the idea that representation partly only matters because it is a commodity that can be made scarce. And so because we have sort of, there's been a ton of scholarship that is like, representation matters. Like, to be seen in media means that you are a person. You do not want to be symbolically annihilated. And so because of that scholarship in some ways, in the ways that it sort of trickles down to the people, there is a way that folks understand like, oh, if I want to see myself, if I want to, in contemporary language, if I want to feel seen, or if I want to be seen in media, I have to pay for it. And so must-see blackness is about this idea that when there is a representation that feels important, that one has to see it, because if you don't, then there's not going to be any more of it. And it is different, for example, when a Tom Hanks movie fails, it was released on a bad weekend, or it was raining outside, or like it was really sunny and people went to the beach. When a black film fails, it's like black folks don't want this and don't deserve it. And so it's about the sort of racial politics of the ways that those kinds of things shake out. And listen, we even saw it with Sinners, where, and I didn't follow Sinners really closely because I didn't care, but the Sinners was being reported as having like a really big opening weekend, but they were like, is it really that big a deal? And then Marty Supreme, which did not do as well, they were like, oh my God, Marty Supreme is so amazing, right? And so it's about the ways that those racial politics play out. And I mean, I am partly calling for like a dropout. You see what you want to and you don't see what you want to, because Hollywood will make those films exactly when they want to and not a second before. And so I'm a fan of dropping out.
I'm coming.
Hello, my name's Allison. I just had a question. If you could talk a little bit more about the way that they marketed the movie or the film itself, because I feel like the marketing portion really matters in regards to audience and the way that they watched it or didn't watch it.
The Wiz was everywhere. One of the things that they did is they did a giant promotion put into New York what is now the Macy's at 32nd-ish, used to be a department store called Gimbel's. And so in what is Herald Square in New York, they actually did a promotion with Gimbel's and like had this whole like carnival day in which they had a number of the folks from the Emerald City sequence in costume, and they were doing giveaways. There were also in the back of certain magazines there were these promos that you could mail in to get like a crow mask on a stick or like and stuff like that. So there were promotions with department stores. Diana Ross also hosted the Tonight Show for a week leading up to the premiere. They did an enormous premiere in New York where they premiered the film in basically Midtown / Times Square, and then after the film, everybody could go to the subway station, including presumably like people like Diana Ross and Michael Jackson, get on the subway, take the subway express down to the World Trade Center, i.e. Emerald City, and then at the top of one of the formerly Twin Towers, there was a huge party. So like they put money into this. So and I will also say that in some places, the over promotion showed up as part of the discourse, like as part of the reason they didn't like it. And one review calls it over-promoted, overdone something. I can't remember what the word is after that, but yeah. So there was and I think there was probably also some anti-Motown-ishness about the film as well. The industry lore is that Diana Ross lost the Oscar in 1972, principally because Berry Gordy and Motown Productions did an actual Oscar campaign before Oscar campaigns were the standard in the industry.
So Al, your microphone's off. Did you turn it off or did you?
Oh, whoops, apparently oh no, actually no, the battery died. Yeah, the battery died. That's over. Oh no, it's red. So yeah, I think the battery's gonna die.
Another question someone to get on deck.
Yeah, hi. I have a question. I'm quite enjoying your speech. I'm noticed in your speech you mentioned a movie, some movie are maybe too black, and a movie for everyone. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think is the difference between a movie for black and a movie for everyone?
So on the one hand, I think a movie for everyone is partly about commodifiable blackness, which is actually why The Wiz was cast in the way it was, because it is about black legibility for whiteness, i.e., in 1978. Like white people generally probably didn't know, say, like June Pointer from the Pointer Sisters. So like, or actually no, here's a actually better example. Stephanie Mills was never going to be cast in the Wiz film because Stephanie Mills was not legible to white folks. What is also important about like 78 is that we're right on the cusp of what becomes the blockbuster era, what becomes the tentpole strategy era. And so it is about films that can actually make a giant splash, and it's partly about the name that is attached. So as much as people crap all over Diana Ross and they're like, you know, yeah, she was sleeping with Berry Gordy and that's how she got the part. The fact is that like that horrible Nina Simone movie with Zoe Saldana, as soon as Diana Ross got attached to The Wiz, the money showed up. And and in fact, The Wiz went into production without a budget because they were just like, make it. Like, we got Diana Ross, make it. And I will also add that The Wiz is mostly expensive because where do you find a giant bejeweled toilet? You don't. And so you have to make it. And you know, and so part of it is the expense of making these fantastical objects. The cheapest thing to acquire in the film was the Emerald City costumes. Joel Schumacher used to be before he became a screenwriter, he was a window dresser. And he and Rob Cohen hatched a plan to plant a gossip column item in which they said, some of New York's top fashion designers are on board to design costumes for The Wiz. And so the item comes out, and then all the designers' agents start calling and being like, is Calvin Klein on the list? And they're like, oh, absolutely Calvin Klein's on the list, not Calvin Klein. Is Bill Blass on the list? Absolutely Bill Blass. And so they get 1,800 costumes for free. Because there's roughly 600 people in each scene, and each of them has a red, green, and a gold costume. Other questions?
Hi. So I was wondering, there was recently an article that I read about I believe it was a Black woman director who said that her film would only get greenlit if Halle Bailey's, Regé-Jean Page's You, Me, and Tuscany did well in the cinema. And it seems that we're kind of like circling back to this maybe like affront by large studios in only greenlighting if thing does good. And putting that in conversation with, I know Sinners is not top of mind, but with like properties that are owned by Black directors and then will eventually revert rights back to Black directors. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about kind of like the futurity of ownership as part of the same conversation. Of course, The Wiz is Sidley Lumet, but also, right, Wizard of Oz, but something else that seems to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, well, so one, Coogler only gets the rights back sooner. So the way that it was discursively reported, it was like, Coogler's getting the rights back, and like, isn't that amazing? And it's, I mean, sure. But also like, directors get the rights back, it's just a longer period, and so he shortens the period. And so we don't know what that will necessarily mean. But what I will simultaneously say is that, you know, when Beyonce released whatever that sort of surprise record was, or maybe it was, yeah, sure. So like when she released that, like folks were like, oh my God, like Beyonce is gonna change the game. And it's like, well, no, she actually because it's like Beyonce can only do that. And maybe Taylor Swift, maybe Gaga. But like, and I love her, but like Solange cannot do that. Like, cannot just be like, hey, I'm doing this thing without going through the sort of traditional routes of telling people that this is a thing. And so there's a way that I'm not certain that Ryan Coogler changes anything other than for Ryan Coogler, which we presumably love. But I will, I mean, and also, I mean, Hollywood is, Hollywood is at least in the hospital. And it's an ICU. And like, it's probably gonna get out of ICU, but it's an ICU. And so there's a way that I'm not even sure what Coogler getting the rights back to that film even means. Because in some ways, y'all don't even go to the movie theaters anymore. And you want to watch everything like at home. And that's also why Netflix just raised y'all's prices. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a way that the more things change, the more they remain the same. And it's in some ways why this concept of must-see Blackness for me is really fascinating, because when we tend to have this conversation about representation mattering, and I'm always just like, well, like, Jesus Christ, which one is the one that's going, like if representation is supposed to save us, which one is it gonna be? Because I'm like, well, it wasn't The Cosby Show, and then it wasn't Blackish, and then it wasn't Black Panther, and it wasn't Sinners. So like, what does the one look like that's supposed to save us? If we're supposed to keep spending because it's gonna save us at some point. And I mean, I am at the point where I'm like, no, this is actually just about saving capitalism and turning us into consumer citizens. And so that's kind of like, I mean, at the end of this essay on surplus Blackness, where I get at my most sort of cranky, is where I'm just like, none of it matters. Like, we see what we want to see, and we don't see what we want to see, and Hollywood will give and Hollywood will take when they actually need money. I mean, but Hollywood might also like die, so who knows? Oh, wait, you're going to another question, okay, yeah.
Hi. Oh, there you go. I want to hear from you. How do you compare the box office failure, but the huge cultural impact of The Wiz with the most recent iterations? Because it was on Broadway recently. There was the NBC version, and the costumes on the NBC version were by Paul Tazewell. I remember when I watched the Emerald City scene, the dancers were voguing. So definitely there is a shift, a cultural shift to elements that are happening right now. So I want to hear from you the changes on these new iterations.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that the stage version of The Wiz, so the stage version of The Wiz and the film The Wiz have nothing in common other than the score. And so there is a, and in some ways, part of the reason that The Wiz as a theatrical production retains its success is because it's actually just in some ways the Judy Garland version with Black people and a different score. Because it's still about, like, it's still Kansas, it's still like a farm family, and so it doesn't, like, so all that changes is the sonic landscape in some ways. And so, and also The Wiz Live was terrible. And that is actually why, or partly why I would suggest, the idea was that that was the production that was going to turn into the Broadway revival, and it was terrible, and so it didn't. This most recent revival is faring better, although it is not better. Well, actually, no, I'm gonna take that lie back. I think if I had seen it in Chicago, I would probably like it. But it actually, like, I saw it on Broadway, and I was just like Glinda literally walked out from the side of the wings, and I was like, not when white Glinda is coming in on a bubble down the street. And so, like, it looked real pedestrian, and it looked real cheap. And so I did not love that version, even though the singing was really great. And actually, the woman, Melody Betts, who was playing Eveline and Aunt Em, she was fantastic. And actually, Wayne Brady was actually good as the Wiz as well. So listen, I said something nice about that production. I feel proud of myself. But I think that, but the other piece of it is that the Wiz was always about adapting the L. Frank Baum text for contemporary times. So the notion that there is voguing in both the Wiz Live version and then also in the version that is touring right now, is kind of like, yeah, absolutely. And so they basically have taken, so Quincy Jones's Emerald City sequence is unique to the film, and the Broadway production has a different song, and it is still the song from the 1970 production, but they actually have just sort of like mixed it up so it feels a little more ballroom. So in some ways, as I said, like the Wiz was always responding to contemporary culture.
So my question is like, if the Wiz can be like reproduced and released in today's like cinema, is that gonna be like success or not? If they still like keep the Blackness, like, yeah.
I mean, here's the thing is like, if they redo it, I ain't going to see it. Because there is a way that part of at least the way that my fandom functions is that like my fandom is for the thing, and like that's the one I want. And listen, in some ways, like if they get, because God help it, like they would probably get like Beyonce, and God help us. Because listen, she is a lot of things, an actress she is not. But I don't want to see anybody other than Diana Ross in 1978 as Dorothy. And so there is something about the idea that, at least for my fandom, I'm not interested in sort of moving it into the new generation. I'm interested in this thing that is my beloved thing. And part of how my fandom, at least, and I think in some ways the fandom of the people who I interviewed, and I have about 50-ish, I have 50 interviews, it is actually, they don't need the Wiz to be updated because it's not necessarily about, ooh, will somebody write this down so I can get it from them and put it down later? It's not about the text, it's actually extra textual. It's about like the feelings that are mapped onto a specific version. And in some ways, it's less about the version. It's less about the thing as much as it's about the version of that thing. So I think that's partly what it is about that text. This is also why I don't write talks, because I stumble upon things when I'm just sort of riffing. So listen, thank you so much for that. Like, listen, I need to get your name so I can put you in the acknowledgments.
It's being recorded, so you'll
Oh, perfect.
let's thank Al for his wonderful talk.
Thank you all.